All right, I want to teach y'all today something that I should have taught you before you did the adding and subtracting mixed numeral IXL. I apologize, I made a mistake. I didn't realize they would give you that until after you did the ones with unlike denominators. But I noticed on one of the ones with like denominators, they expect you to know how to borrow. So if you've been having trouble with adding, subtracting, mixed numerals with unlike denominators because you didn't know how to borrow, that's my fault. And hopefully you can go back in and master it. By the way, I want to say everyone's been doing a great job. I think Jacob DeCourt has done the greatest. He's got 100% on 5 out of 5 things I've assigned. I never dreamed you'd do that good that soon. So Jacob, great job. Keep up the good work. And everybody else, he's showing you that it can be done. But really, I wouldn't have expected you to be able to borrow until I taught you how. By the way, I did make another mistake. Mira emailed me and told me that I had made a mistake on one of the videos earlier on adding and subtracting with unlike denominators, and I did make a mistake. I've been doing a lot of these videos, and sometimes my mind gets kind of squished, so I apologize. But on the problem Mira had, the answer came out to be 1 and 2 over 8. And I told her that the answer was 1 and 1/2. Oh, no, I'm wrong. Bad, bad mistake. 2 goes into 2 once, 2 goes into 8 4 times, so the right answer was 1 and 1/4. But again, you have to make sure it's simplified. But do better than me and simplify correctly. I apologize for any confusion I've given you, and I'm doing my best to make sure I don't make any mistakes today. But anyway, we need to learn how to subtract when you have to borrow. Now, I showed you one of those the last day before we finished with school on Friday, a situation like this, where you have something like 7 minus 2 and 3/4. And we discussed the fact that you have to get something here, and the only place to get it from is here. So we talked about how if you borrow from one from the 7 and make it a 6, then you can put the one you borrowed here. But you don't want to put one whole, because you can't take 3/4 away from one whole. You need to make it a fraction. So remember, 1 equals 1 over 1, because 1 divided by 1 is 1. Or it equals 2 over 2, because 2 divided by 2 equals 1. Or it equals 3 over 3, because 3 divided by 3 equals 1. And it could be 1,000,000 over 1,000,000, because 1,000,000 divided by 1,000,000 equals 1. Any number over itself is equal to 1. And again, you could take and make the one that you borrowed 1 over 1, or 2 over 2, or 3 over 3, or 1,000,000 over 1,000,000. But you don't want to make it any of those things. You want to make it 4 over 4. And as we discussed the last Friday, that's so you'll have a common denominator. So when you're subtracting and there's nothing there, you can take whatever this denominator is and make the numerator and denominator the same as this denominator. And then you could subtract 4 minus 3 is 1/4, and 6 minus 2 is 4. And again, your answer would be 4 and 1/4. Make sure it's proper. In subtraction, it almost always is. And it is here, because 1 is less than 4. And make sure it's simplified. If the numerator is 1, it's automatically simplified, so this is right. By the way, the main reason that people get this wrong is not because they get the wrong fraction. The main reason most people get this wrong is because they get the wrong whole number. Because instead of 4 and 1/4, they'll tell me the answer is 5 and 1/4. And why would they tell me the answer is 5 and 1/4? Because when they borrow, they don't borrow. And what do I mean when they borrow, they don't borrow? I mean they make the fraction 4/4, because that's easy to remember once you learn it. But they don't cross out the 7 and make it a 6. So when you borrow, whatever you do, don't forget to borrow. Now again, I taught you this before we got on this long break. But what I didn't teach you yet, and what you need to know for even subtracting mixed numerals with like denominators. Okay, what you need to know is if you have a problem like this, 7 3/5 minus 2 4/5, which, by the way, is a problem I noticed somebody had that they were really struggling with. And again, your struggle with that was not your fault, it was my fault. I didn't think they were going to tell you or expect you to be able to borrow until you knew how to find, subtract with a common denominator. But anyway, in a case like this, again, I can't take 4/5 away from 3/5. So I have to borrow. And to borrow, first you cross out the 7 and make it a 6, just like before. Now again, I don't make it 4/4, like I did before, because I already have 3/4. So I borrowed 1, and I'm going to add the 3/5 that I already have there. Because again, what I borrow, I add to what I already had. So I don't put a 1 in front of 3 and make this 13, because I didn't borrow 10/5. Okay? I borrowed 1 whole. And again, I could make 1 whole 1/1, or 2/2, or 3/3, or 1,000,000/1,000,000. But the best thing to make it would be 5/5. And then I could add 5/5 plus 3/5, and that would equal 8/5. And so I would change the 3 here to an 8. And again, that's what's happening every time you borrow. That's what you're doing. But there's a neat little trick I learned a long time ago that you can do the same thing without all the work. Now what's really happening is you're borrowing 1 and you're making it 5/5, and you're adding the 5/5 to the 3/5 to get 8/5. But here's a way you can do it and skip all the work. What you can do is you can add the denominator plus the numerator will give you the new numerator. You see, 5 plus 3 equals 8. Will that work all the time? I wouldn't show it to you if it didn't. But again, it saves you from having to do the work. All right, by the way, if you're curious why it works, okay, the reason it works is because when you add the 5/5 you borrowed plus the 3/5 you already had, you made this 5/5 because you made this numerator and denominator the same as this denominator. So this numerator is the same as the denominator. So when you add numerator plus numerator, it's the same as adding denominator plus denominator. And there's something I've noticed that some people had trouble with in the 6th grade when they were doing this, okay? What they were doing is instead of adding the denominator plus the numerator gives you the new numerator, they added the numerator plus the numerator to get the new numerator. That is not how you're supposed to do it. Again, the shortcut is add denominator plus numerator gives you the new numerator. If you want, you can do it the long way by making it 1 plus 3/5 and make 1 5/5 plus 3/5 is 8/5. But if you want to skip that work, this is the way to do it. Now again, I didn't think they would give you one like this when you had a common denominator. But I knew they would give you one like this when you had different denominators. Like if you had 5 1/3 minus 2 5/6. Now again, to do this, the first thing you need is a common denominator. And in this case, it's pretty easy to find, because if you take the biggest denominator, 6, and list the 6 times table until you find something that 3 goes into, 6 times 1 is 6, and 3 goes into it. So the common denominator is 6. Now you might remember on the other video, I told you I bring the whole numbers over in subtraction when I didn't bring it in addition. And I told you I'd explain later why I'm doing that. So now I'll explain to you why I'm doing that. The reason I'm doing that is in case you have to borrow. Because the main reason people get subtraction with borrowing wrong is because they forget to borrow when they borrow. So if you bring the whole number over, you're less likely to forget to borrow. If the whole number's way over here and the fraction's way over here, I could see where you might forget to borrow. But if the whole number's right next to the fraction, hopefully you won't. But anyway, before I borrow, I need to find the missing numerators. 3 goes into 6 2 times. 2 times 1 is 2. 6 goes into 6 one time. 1 times 5 is 5. And now I'm trying to take 5 away from 2, and I can't do it. So here's where what we just learned comes into play. Here's where we have to borrow. We cross out the 5 and make it a 4. And again, when you borrow, don't forget to borrow. And secondly, add the 6 plus the 2. Add the denominator plus the numerator will give you the new numerator. 6 plus 2 is 8. Now I can subtract. 8 minus 5 is 3/6. And 4 minus 2 is 2. And again, is my answer proper? Yes. Is it simplified? No. And again, what goes into both 3 and 6? 3 does. 3 goes into 3 once, and 3 goes into 6 twice. So the right answer is 2 1/2. And again, excuse me, some people get this problem wrong because they leave it 3/6 and they don't borrow. But some people get this problem wrong and they do make it 1/2. But instead of 2 1/2, they give me 3 1/2. And why would they give me 3 1/2? Because when they borrow from the 5 to make this 6 plus 2 is 8/6, they don't cross out the 5 and make it a 4. And again, if you forget to borrow, you'll always get the whole number wrong. So when you borrow, don't forget to borrow. So the 2 things you have to do every time you subtract fractions and have to borrow. Number 1, you have to cross out the whole number and make it 1 less. And number 2, you have to add the denominator plus the numerator to get the new numerator. Or if you don't want to use the shortcut and add denominator and numerator, get the new numerator. Or if you forget the shortcut, you could always go back and say you borrowed 1 and you're adding it to 2/6. And again, 1 could be 1 over 1 or 2 over 2 or 1,000,000 over 1,000,000. But I want it to be 6 over 6, so I'll have a common denominator. And 6/6 plus 2/6 is 8/6, which is like what I got with the shortcut. I highly recommend you use the shortcut because it makes it so much easier. But just don't forget to borrow. Again, I'm sorry for any confusion that you've had so far, but y'all are all, most of you are all working pretty good. When I looked online, there's still some of you haven't even gone on at all, yet most of you have at least mastered 1 or 2 topics over 80%. And remember, you just have to get over 80%, but you really want to strive for 100%. And again, Jacob Dakota is the best of everyone because he's got 500% already. And again, Jacob, I saw that you spent a lot of time on the adding and subtracting mixed numerals. It's most probably because you didn't know how to borrow when you subtract, and that's my fault. I really apologize. By the way, in the future, if you see a mistake